The elderly man thought his son was taking him to the nursing home, but burst into tears when he saw the true place he was being taken to. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The grandfather clock in the corner of Thomas Harrison's modern London townhouse chimed 3 times, its sound echoing through the pristine hallway. William Harrison, known affectionately as Will to his friends and family, sat in his small bedroom, staring out the window at the manicured garden below. At 74, his weathered hands rested on the windowsill, fingers drumming an irregular rhythm as he watched his daughter-in-law, Sarah, tending to her prized roses. The roses were beautiful, he had to admit, but they weren't the same as his beloved cottage garden in the Cotswolds. His garden had been wild and free, a symphony of colors and scents that had made the local gardening society green with envy. Margaret, his wife, had always said their garden was a reflection of their love, uncontained, natural, and ever-growing. Will's eyes drifted to the small collection of possessions that now defined his life. A few clothes, some books, and a single photograph of Margaret that had been digitally restored from a damaged original. Everything else had been lost in the electrical fire that had consumed their cottage 6 months ago, while he had been in the stable checking on Thunder, his beloved horse. The sound of the front door opening drew his attention. Thomas, his son, was home early from his tech startup in central London. These days, Will could read the tension in his son's footsteps, the quick, determined stride that spoke of deadlines, responsibilities, and the weight of caring for an aging father who felt increasingly out of place in this modern home. "Dad?" Thomas's voice carried up the stairs. "Are you up for a cup of tea?" Will smoothed down his cardigan, Margaret's last Christmas gift to him, now showing signs of wear at the elbows. "Coming down," he called back, his voice carrying a cheerfulness he didn't feel. In the kitchen, Sarah was already setting out the bone china teacups. Not the sturdy mugs he and Margaret had collected over their 48 years together, but delicate things that made him nervous every time he lifted one. Thomas sat at the island counter, his laptop open beside him, fingers still typing as Will lowered himself onto a stool. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" Thomas asked, finally closing his laptop. The concern in his son's eyes made Will feel even more like a burden. "Oh, you know me, keeping busy," Will replied, though they all knew it wasn't true. His days were filled with endless hours of watching television programs he didn't understand, and thumbing through magazines about a world that seemed to have left him behind. Sarah placed a cup of tea in front of him, made exactly as he liked it, weak, with just a splash of milk. "I was thinking," she said, exchanging a quick glance with Thomas, "perhaps you'd like to look at some retirement communities. There's a lovely one in Surrey that has its own garden club." Will's heart sank further. So this was it. They were finally trying to find somewhere else for him to go. He couldn't blame them. He was taking up space in their carefully ordered lives, a reminder of a slower, older England that didn't fit with their smart home technology and weekend yoga sessions. "Actually," he said quietly, surprising himself, "I think that might be for the best." The words tasted bitter, but the relief that flickered across Thomas's face confirmed what Will had suspected for months. He was a burden here. "Dad, no. That's not what we—" Thomas began, but Will raised a hand to stop him. "I know you both have busy lives, and this isn't home for me. It never will be. Perhaps it's time I found somewhere more suitable." Will's fingers traced the rim of his teacup, remembering how Margaret used to read his tea leaves, making up increasingly outlandish fortunes that would leave them both laughing until their sides ached. Sarah reached across the counter and squeezed his hand. "We just want you to be happy, Will. You've seemed so lonely lately." Will nodded, unable to meet their eyes. How could he explain that his loneliness wasn't something that could be fixed with activities and garden clubs? How could he tell them about the ache he felt every morning when he woke up and for just a moment expected to hear Margaret singing off-key in their cottage kitchen? How could he describe the phantom pain of missing his garden, his horse, the life he'd built over 7 decades? "I think I'll go up and rest for a bit," Will said, leaving his tea half-finished. As he climbed the stairs, he heard Thomas and Sarah's whispered conversation begin, their words indistinct but their tone clear. Concern, frustration, and something else he couldn't quite identify. In his room, Will pulled out the small notebook he'd started keeping since the fire. In it, He tried to record every detail he could remember about the cottage, the way the afternoon sun hit the kitchen window, the creaky third step on the stairs, the exact shade of blue Margaret had insisted on for the sitting room walls. He was terrified of forgetting even the smallest detail. As the afternoon light began to fade, Will made a decision. Tomorrow he would tell Thomas and Sarah to start looking for a retirement home in earnest. It would be better this way, for everyone. He closed his notebook and placed it carefully in the drawer of his bedside table, next to Margaret's restored photograph. Outside, a car alarm started wailing, and Will found himself longing for the peaceful evenings in the Cotswolds, where the only sounds were wood pigeons in the oak trees and the distant whinny of thunder in his paddock. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to drift back to those happier days, unaware that in Thomas's home office downstairs, plans were already in motion that would change everything. Sarah Harrison sat cross-legged on the floor of their home office, surrounded by papers, architectural drawings, and old photographs. The clock had just struck midnight, but she barely noticed, too absorbed in comparing the images spread before her. Each photograph showed different angles of Will and Margaret's cottage, taken during various family visits over the years. "This shade of blue," she murmured, holding up a photo to the light. "Thomas, are you sure the painters can match it exactly?" Thomas looked up from his laptop where he was reviewing the latest construction updates. The samples they sent matched perfectly with the digital color analysis. Dad always said Mum chose it because it reminded her of cornflowers. The renovation project had been consuming their lives for the past 3 months, ever since Thomas's startup had secured its major funding. The idea had come to Sarah in the middle of the night, watching Will shuffle around their house like a ghost, touching nothing, changing nothing, as if afraid to leave any mark of himself behind. "The contractor sent the latest timeline," Thomas said, turning his laptop so Sarah could see. "They're ahead of schedule. The main structure is complete, and they're working on the interior now. Old Mrs. Pembroke next door has been keeping an eye on everything, sending daily updates." Sarah smiled, remembering the elderly neighbors' enthusiasm when they'd shared their plans. The entire village had rallied around the project, keeping it secret from Will while providing invaluable details about the cottage's original features. "And Thunder?" she asked, gathering the photographs into neat piles. "Doing well at the Hendersons' farm. Their daughter says he perks up every time someone visits, like he's expecting Dad." Thomas removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I just hope we're doing the right thing. You saw how he reacted when you mentioned the retirement home today." Sarah stood up, stretching her stiff muscles. "That's exactly why we need to do this. Did you see his face? He thinks we're trying to get rid of him." The truth couldn't have been further from that. For weeks they'd been orchestrating the biggest surprise of Will's life, coordinating with contractors, neighbors, and local craftsmen to rebuild his and Margaret's cottage exactly as it had been before the fire. Every detail was being meticulously recreated, from the hand-carved mantelpiece to Margaret's beloved garden layout. "The Garden Society ladies have been amazing," Sarah said, picking up a detailed planting plan. "They've propagated cuttings from their own gardens to replace all of Margaret's original plants. Mrs. Pembroke even had some of the rare roses Margaret was so proud of." Thomas smiled, remembering how his mother and father would spend hours in their garden, planning, planting, and simply enjoying each other's company. After Margaret's passing, the garden had become Will's connection to her, each bloom and branch holding memories of their life together. "Dad's going to know something's up when we suggest a trip," Thomas mused, closing his laptop. "He hasn't wanted to leave the house much since he came to stay with us." Sarah sat on the edge of the desk, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Actually, I have an idea about that. Remember how he used to love visiting garden shows with your mum? There's a prestigious one happening near the Cotswolds next month. We could suggest taking him to that. And then take a wrong turn that leads us to the cottage." Thomas raised an eyebrow, grinning. "Sneaky. I like it." They spent the next hour reviewing their timeline. The cottage would be ready in 3 weeks, but they wanted to give the garden time to settle in, for the newly laid turf to take root, for Margaret's beloved flowers to establish themselves. The garden show would be perfect timing. A floorboard creaked overhead, Will making his way to the bathroom, a journey he made every night at almost exactly the same time. Thomas and Sarah froze, listening to the familiar shuffle of his slippers on the hardwood floor. "I caught him looking at houses online yesterday," Sarah whispered, once the footsteps had returned to his room. Retirement properties. He's really thinking about leaving, Thomas. Thomas nodded, his expression serious. Then we're doing this just in time. You know what Dad's like? Once he makes up his mind about something, it's almost impossible to change it. Sarah began gathering up the papers, carefully filing them away in a locked drawer. They'd learned to be cautious after Will had almost discovered their plans last week, when he'd walked into the kitchen while Thomas was on the phone with the contractor. "Oh, I almost forgot," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "The framing shop called. They've finished restoring the wedding photograph we found in the debris. They've done an amazing job. You can hardly tell it was damaged." She showed Thomas the image on her phone. Will and Margaret on their wedding day, young and radiant, standing in front of the village church. It would take pride of place on the cottage's mantelpiece, just as it had for nearly 50 years. "Perfect," Thomas said softly. "You know, when the fire happened, I thought we'd lost everything. Finding that photo in the ruins, it felt like a sign." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Your mum would be so proud of what you're doing for your dad. I just hope it's enough," Thomas replied, staring at the construction plans. "I hope it helps him feel like himself again." Outside, an owl hooted softly, reminding them both of the peaceful nights they'd spent at the cottage. Soon, God willing, Will would be back there, surrounded by the memories and the life he loved so much. But for now they had 3 more weeks of secret-keeping, of watching him retreat further into himself, of pretending they weren't planning the surprise of a lifetime. Sarah yawned and started turning off lights. "Come on, we should get some sleep. The interior designer's coming tomorrow to match the original upholstery for Margaret's reading chair." As they headed upstairs, they passed Will's room. A soft light showed under the door. He was probably writing in his notebook again, recording memories they hoped to give back to him soon. Thomas paused for a moment, hand resting on the wall, and Sarah knew he was fighting the urge to tell his father everything right then and there. "Soon," she whispered, taking his hand. "Just a few more weeks." They went to bed that night with heads full of paint samples and planting schedules, while down the hall, Will sat in his chair, dreaming of a garden he thought he'd never see again. The following week brought unseasonably warm weather to London, the kind that reminded Will of lazy Sunday afternoons in the Cotswolds. He sat in Thomas's garden, watching a pair of robins hop across the immaculately trimmed lawn. Sarah's garden was beautiful, but it lacked the wild charm he and Margaret had cultivated over the years. "More tea, Will?" Sarah appeared beside him, already refilling his cup. She'd been unusually attentive lately, almost hovering. Will had noticed both her and Thomas watching him with an odd mixture of anticipation and concern. "Thank you, dear." He accepted the cup, noting how she'd started serving it in one of her everyday mugs instead of the formal china. These small kindnesses made his decision to leave even harder. "Sarah, I've been looking at some retirement communities online." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she set down the teapot. "Oh, have you found any you like?" "There's one in Devon. They have a community garden." He trailed off, remembering how Margaret had always said Devon was too far from family. "Though perhaps that's too distant." Sarah sat down beside him, fiddling with her wedding ring, a nervous habit Will had noticed over the years. "You know, there's no rush to make any decisions. Thomas and I were thinking, well, there's a garden show coming up next month, the Hampton Court Palace Garden Festival. We thought you might enjoy it." Will's interest piqued despite himself. He and Margaret had attended dozens of garden shows over the years, always returning home with boots full of mud and cars loaded with new plants. That might be nice," he admitted. "Wonderful." Sarah's enthusiasm seemed disproportionate to his tepid response. "I'll tell Thomas. He's been wanting to take a few days off work anyway." Inside the house, the phone rang, and Sarah hurried to answer it. Will could hear her speaking in hushed tones, catching phrases like ahead of schedule and perfect match. Probably something to do with Thomas's business. They were always having mysterious conversations these days. Will closed his eyes, letting his mind drift back to his last garden show with Margaret. It had been just 2 years before she passed, and she'd insisted on buying an entire collection of heritage roses, even though their garden was already overflowing. "There's always room for more beauty," she'd said, her eyes twinkling with that familiar determination. Thunder had been fascinated by those roses, always trying to nibble the blooms through the paddock fence. Will's heart ached at the thought of his horse. After the fire, he'd been too unwell to ask about Thunder's fate, and by the time he was stable enough to inquire, he'd been afraid to hear the answer. "Dad?" Thomas's voice broke through his reverie. His son stood before him, suit jacket slung over his shoulder, looking unusually casual for a workday. "How do you feel about going out for lunch? There's a new place near the park that does a proper Sunday roast." Will studied his son's face, noting the same barely contained excitement he'd seen in Sarah. They were up to something, these two, but he couldn't fathom what. "That would be lovely," he said, deciding to play along. "Let me just change my cardigan." In his room, Will caught his reflection in the mirror as he changed. He looked older than his 74 years, grief and displacement having carved deep lines around his eyes. Margaret would have scolded him for letting himself go like this. "You're still handsome as ever, my love," she would have said, straightening his collar just so. The restaurant turned out to be a cozy affair, reminiscent of the village pub near their cottage. As they settled into their booth, Will noticed Thomas checking his phone repeatedly, typing quick messages when he thought Will wasn't looking. "Everything all right at work?" Will asked, more to break the silence than anything else. "What?" "Oh yes, fine. Just some project details to sort out." Thomas pocketed his phone, looking guilty. "Actually, Dad, I wanted to talk to you about something." Will's heart sank. Here it comes, he thought, the gentle push toward the retirement home. "Oh, Sarah mentioned the garden show to you. I think it would do us all good to get away for a few days. Maybe visit some old haunts." Thomas studied his father's face carefully. Will's hands clenched under the table. "I don't know if I'm ready to go back there, son." "We don't have to decide anything now," Thomas said quickly. "Just think about it. The show's not for a few weeks yet." Their food arrived, saving Will from having to respond. The roast was excellent, but it made him think of Margaret's cooking, how she'd always insisted on Yorkshire puddings the size of bowls, claiming that was how her grandmother made them. As they ate, Thomas kept steering the conversation toward memories of the cottage, asking detailed questions about everything from the color of the kitchen tiles to the pattern of the hallway wallpaper. Will answered carefully, wondering if his son was worried about his memory. "And the garden?" Thomas pressed. "You had that special watering system for the rose garden, didn't you?" Will nodded, remembering the elaborate irrigation setup he'd designed. "Your mother thought I was mad, spending weeks getting it just right. But it meant we could go on holiday without worrying about her precious roses. You still remember how you set it up?" "Every pipe and sprinkler head," Will replied automatically, then frowned. "Though I suppose that knowledge isn't much use now." Thomas's phone buzzed again, and this time Will caught a glimpse of the message. All set for final inspection. Before he could ponder what that might mean, Thomas was asking about the heritage apple trees they'd planted for Will's 70th birthday. The questions continued through dessert, becoming so specific that Will finally had to ask, "Son, is there a reason for all this reminiscing?" Thomas's face flushed slightly. "Just missing Mum, I suppose, and wanting to make sure we remember everything properly." On the drive home, Will watched the London streets blur past, so different from the narrow lanes of their village. He'd thought he was ready to make peace with never seeing those lanes again, never smelling the wild garlic in the hedgerows or hearing the church bells on Sunday morning. But Thomas's questions had awakened something in him, a longing so intense it left him breathless. Back at the house, Sarah was waiting with fresh tea and an expectant look. "How was lunch?" "Lovely," Thomas answered, sharing a meaningful glance with his wife. "Dad was just telling me about Mum's Yorkshire puddings." "Oh?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "Will, you'll have to show me her recipe sometime." Will nodded absently, his mind still in the Cotswolds. That night, he added several pages to his notebook, desperate to capture every detail Thomas's questions had stirred up. Outside his window, a fox slunk through Sarah's pristine garden, and for just a moment Will could pretend he was back home, watching the wildlife that Margaret had always welcomed into their garden. Sleep was slow to come that night, his dreams full of blooming roses and the sound of Thunder's hooves on soft grass. In the room below, Thomas and Sarah sat surrounded by paint samples and fabric swatches, their whispered conversation drifting up through the floorboards like a lullaby of hope. Sarah stood in the middle of what would soon be Will's restored sitting room, surrounded by craftsmen and the organized chaos of renovation. The cottage walls, freshly painted in Margaret's beloved cornflower blue, glowed in the morning light streaming through the new windows. The original chair was just here, she directed, pointing to a spot near the fireplace, and it had to be angled exactly right so Margaret could see both the garden and the television. The delivery men nodded, carefully positioning the replica of Margaret's favorite armchair, an exact match right down to the fabric pattern, which they'd had specially recreated from old photographs. Her phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. Dad asking more questions about retirement homes. How soon can we be ready? Sarah typed back quickly. 2 weeks max, garden starting to look established. Mrs. Pembroke says Thunder recognizes his old stable. The elderly neighbor had been their saving grace throughout this project, providing countless details about the cottage's original layout and keeping an eye on the construction progress. She'd even helped them track down Thunder, who'd been temporarily housed at a nearby farm after the fire. Mrs. Harrison? The site foreman approached with a tablet. We've finished installing the irrigation system according to your father-in-law's original design. Would you like to see it in action? Sarah followed him into the garden, where the morning sun illuminated beds of newly planted flowers. The Garden Society ladies had outdone themselves, sourcing heritage varieties that matched Margaret's original collection. Some had even been propagated from cuttings of the original plants, shared among neighbors over the years. The irrigation system hummed to life, sending a fine mist over the roses. Sarah smiled, remembering Will's detailed descriptions of the setup. Thomas had recorded their entire lunch conversation yesterday, ensuring they got every detail right. Back inside, the house was coming together like a puzzle, each piece carefully chosen to match Will's memories. The wooden floors had been aged to match the original patina, the doorframes distressed just enough to show decades of family life, and the kitchen tiles laid in the exact pattern Margaret had chosen 30 years ago. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Taking Dad to doctor's appointment, coast clear for delivery of wedding photo. Right on cue, a small van pulled up outside. The restored photograph had been their greatest challenge, salvaging the fire-damaged original and having it professionally restored. The result was remarkable, capturing Will and Margaret's joy on their wedding day with stunning clarity. As Sarah helped position the photo on the mantelpiece, Mrs. Pembroke appeared at the garden door, bearing her usual basket of tea and biscuits. "How's our boy doing?" she asked, settling into one of the kitchen chairs they'd had custom-made to match the originals. "Missing home more than ever," Sarah sighed, accepting a cup of tea. "He's talking about retirement homes again. I hate seeing him so lost." Mrs. Pembroke patted her hand. "You're doing a wonderful thing here, dear. Margaret would be so proud of you both." She glanced around the kitchen, nodding approvingly. "Though she'd probably say you've made it too tidy. That woman could create chaos in the most organized kitchen." They shared a laugh, remembering Margaret's legendary cooking experiments. Will had once told them she'd managed to turn a simple Victoria sponge into something resembling concrete, but he'd eaten every bite, claiming it was interestingly textured. The afternoon brought more deliveries, carefully reproduced family photographs, arranged in identical frames, Margaret's collection of botanical prints, which Mrs. Pembroke had kept safe for years, even the ancient grandfather clock that had somehow survived the fire and had been painstakingly restored. Sarah supervised each placement, consulting the detailed notes and photographs they'd compiled. The goal wasn't just to recreate a house, it was to rebuild a home filled with the memories and comfort Will had lost. "The garden bench has arrived," called one of the workers. "The one with the special inscription?" Sarah hurried outside. This had been Thomas's idea, having a new bench made with the same inscription Will and Margaret had carved on their original, "Where love blooms eternal." They'd positioned it exactly where the old one had stood, under the sprawling oak tree that had somehow survived the fire. As she stood admiring the bench, her phone rang. It was Thomas, speaking in hushed tones. "Dad's appointment finished early. We're heading home, but he's in a state. The doctor suggested some tests and, well, he's talking about making decisions soon." Sarah's heart clenched. "How soon is soon?" "He's making calls to retirement homes tomorrow." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "We need to move up our timeline." Sarah looked around the almost completed cottage, mentally calculating what still needed to be done. "The garden show is in 3 weeks. We can't wait that long, can we?" "No," Thomas agreed. What if we brought him this weekend instead?" Sarah's mind raced through the logistics. The house was nearly ready, The garden was settling in, and Thunder was already comfortable in his rebuilt stable. "Let me talk to the team. We might be able to finish everything in time." After ending the call, Sarah gathered the workers, explaining the situation. To her amazement, they all volunteered to work extra hours, touched by the story of what they were creating. Mrs. Pembroke immediately began organizing the village women to help with the final garden preparations. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the new lawn, Sarah stood in what would soon be Will's bedroom. The view from the window was exactly as he'd described it. The rose garden in the foreground, Thunder's paddock beyond, and the village church spire rising above the trees. Everything was ready, or would be soon. She touched the freshly painted windowsill, imagining Will standing in this spot again, surrounded by the life he thought he'd lost forever. Outside, a robin landed on the garden bench, tilting its head as if approving their work. Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. "Dad's gone up to his room, meeting tonight to plan this weekend." She looked around the room once more, at all the love and memory they'd rebuilt, piece by piece. "Yes," she typed back. "Hey, it's time to bring him home." The morning dawned grey and misty, as Will sat at Thomas's kitchen table, methodically working his way through a stack of retirement home brochures. Each glossy page promised comfort, activities, and a new beginning. But all Will could see were identical corridors and strangers' faces. "More coffee?" Sarah's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, still in her dressing gown, watching him with an odd intensity. "No, thank you, dear." Will gathered the brochures into a neat pile. "I think I've seen enough for today." Sarah slid into the chair opposite him, her usual morning tea forgotten. "Will, Thomas and I have been thinking. Before you make any final decisions, would you come somewhere with us this weekend?" Will looked up, noting the slight tremor in her hands. "The garden show isn't for weeks yet, is it?" "No, this is something else." "Something important?" She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "Just trust us." Before Will could respond, Thomas burst into the kitchen, already dressed for work, but wearing a nervous energy that seemed at odds with his usual composed demeanor. "Good morning, Dad, you're up early." "Just doing some research." Will gestured to the brochures. "Sarah was just saying something about this weekend." Father and son exchanged a look that spoke volumes, though Will couldn't decipher their meaning. Thomas sat down, pushing the brochures aside. "Yes, we'd like to take you on a short trip. There's something we need to show you." Will felt a flutter of anxiety in his chest. "I don't know, son. I'm not much for traveling these days." "Please, Dad." Thomas's voice carried an urgency Will hadn't heard before. "It's important. And I promise, if you still want to look at retirement homes afterward, we'll support whatever decision you make." Will studied their earnest faces, remembering how Margaret would tease him about his reluctance to try new things. "You're as set in your ways as that old oak tree," she'd say, laughing. "But even old oaks need to sway in the wind sometimes." "All right," he conceded. "Where are we going?" "It's a surprise," Sarah said quickly, standing up. "We'll leave Saturday morning. Pack for a couple of days, nothing fancy." The rest of the week passed in a blur of nervous energy. Will noticed Thomas and Sarah constantly on their phones, speaking in hushed tones and falling silent whenever he entered the room. He caught fragments of conversations about final preparations and everything being ready, but whenever he asked, they'd smile mysteriously and change the subject. By Friday evening, Will's curiosity had turned to genuine concern. He sat in his room, half-heartedly packing a small bag, when he heard Sarah on the phone outside his door. "Yes, everything's perfect. No, he doesn't suspect a thing. Yes, we'll be there around 11. Her voice faded as she moved down the hallway. Will sat heavily on his bed, his mind racing. Were they planning to take him directly to a retirement home? Had they already chosen one? The thought sent a chill through him. But no, they'd promised to support his decision after this mysterious trip. He pulled out his notebook, turning to the pages where he'd recorded every detail of his old life. Perhaps it was time to let go of these memories, to stop clutching at a past that couldn't be recovered. Yet as he traced his finger over his careful descriptions of the cottage's rooms, the garden's layout, the way Thunder would whinny at sunrise, he knew he wasn't ready. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Thomas stood in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "All packed, Dad?" Will nodded toward his small bag. "Not that I know what I'm packing for." Thomas came in and sat beside him, noticing the open notebook. Writing about home again. Just memories. Will closed the notebook carefully. Your mother always said I was too sentimental for my own good. No such thing as too sentimental, Thomas said softly. He hesitated, then added, Dad, I know these past months haven't been easy. After the fire when you were in hospital, I was so afraid we'd lost you too. Will felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. I'm sorry for being such a burden. No, Thomas's response was fierce. You've never been a burden, never. He stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. Sometimes we don't express things well, Sarah and I. But everything we've done, everything we're doing, it's because we love you. Will was struck by the emotion in his son's voice. Thomas paused at the door. Just remember that tomorrow, okay? Remember that everything we do is out of love. That night, Will lay awake long into the small hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of London traffic and wondering what tomorrow would bring. In his dreams, he walked through the cottage garden with Margaret, her hand warm in his, while thunder grazed peacefully in the distance. Morning came too quickly, grey light filtering through the curtains as Will dressed in his comfortable clothes, old corduroys and Margaret's favourite cardigan. He could hear Sarah and Thomas moving around downstairs, their voices carrying an undercurrent of excitement. As he descended the stairs, Will's heart was pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Whatever this surprise was, he sensed it would change everything. Sarah was pacing the hallway, car keys jingling in her hand, while Thomas loaded several mysterious bags into the car. Ready, Dad? Thomas asked, his voice gentle. Will looked at their eager, nervous faces, thought of Margaret's words about old oaks swaying in the wind, and nodded. Ready as I'll ever be. As they pulled away from the house, Will watched London's streets give way to suburban sprawl, then to motorway. Sarah and Thomas kept exchanging glances in the rear-view mirror, their excitement almost palpable now. Will closed his eyes, wondering what lay at the end of this journey, unaware that every mile was bringing him closer to everything he thought he'd lost forever. The car wound through increasingly familiar countryside, though Will was too lost in thought to notice at first. Sarah was driving, with Thomas constantly checking his phone in the passenger seat. Their whispered conversations had given way to an anticipatory silence that filled the car like a physical presence. It wasn't until they passed a particular crooked oak tree that Will's attention snapped to his surroundings. He knew that tree, had passed it countless times over the years. But surely they couldn't be. Thomas, his voice wavered slightly. Where exactly are we going? Almost there, Dad, Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. Just trust us a little longer. Will's heart began to race as they turned onto a narrow lane he knew as well as his own name. The hedgerows were exactly as he remembered them, thick with late spring growth and dotted with wild roses. This was impossible. They couldn't be heading toward... The car rounded the final bend, and Will's world stopped turning. There, bathed in morning sunlight, stood his cottage, his home. Not the charred ruins he'd last seen from his hospital window, but the cottage as it had always been, from the weathered stone walls to the climbing roses framing the front door. Margaret's roses. What? Will's voice failed him. He pressed his hands against the car window, drinking in every detail. The blue-painted shutters, the window boxes full of trailing petunias, the garden gate with its familiar creak as Sarah pushed it open. Welcome home, Dad, Thomas said softly, opening Will's car door. Will stepped out on shaking legs, overwhelmed by the scent of the garden, his garden. The beds were full of Margaret's favourite flowers, arranged exactly as they had been, from the lavender border to the heritage roses. The old oak tree still stood guardian over it all, its branches spreading wide in welcome. How? He managed to whisper. Sarah took his arm, steadying him. After the fire, when Thomas's company succeeded, we knew what we had to do. Every detail, everything you've been telling us about, writing about in your notebook, we rebuilt it all. Those papers I signed, building permits, Thomas confirmed, not sales contracts for a retirement home. We've been planning this for months. Will moved forward as if in a dream, touching the rough stone of the walls, the smooth wood of the doorframe. Everything was exactly as it had been, down to the slight unevenness in the front step that he and Margaret had always meant to fix but never had. Inside, he stopped dead in his tracks. The sitting room was perfect. Margaret's chair angled just so by the fireplace, their wedding photograph restored and hanging in its rightful place. The walls were the exact shade of cornflower blue that Margaret had chosen all those years ago. "The kitchen," he murmured, moving through the familiar space. The old tiles, the worn countertops, even the small chip in the windowsill where he'd dropped a flower pot 20 years ago, all had been recreated with painstaking accuracy. Sarah opened a drawer, revealing Margaret's old recipe box. Mrs. Pembroke kept it safe after the fire. "She's been helping us, along with half the village. Everyone wanted to bring you home." Will ran his fingers over the recipe cards, recognizing Margaret's flowing handwriting. Tears began to fall freely now, but he barely noticed them. A familiar whinny broke through his daze. "Thunder?" Will's head snapped up. "But I thought—" Thomas took his arm, leading him to the back door. There, in the paddock beyond the garden, stood Thunder, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. The horse raised his head at Will's approach, nickering softly in recognition. "He's been at the Hendersons' farm," Thomas explained. "They've been caring for him while we rebuilt the stable. He's been waiting for you." Will moved as if magnetized toward the paddock gate. Thunder met him there, dropping his great head to nuzzle Will's shoulder. Their old greeting, unchanged by time or circumstance. "The whole village has been helping," Sarah said, watching Will stroke Thunder's nose. "The Garden Society ladies propagated cuttings from their own gardens to match your original plants. The local craftsmen worked overtime to recreate every detail. Even the irrigation system is exactly as you designed it." Will turned slowly, taking in the full scope of what they had done. The garden was alive with color, just as it had always been. Margaret's beloved rose garden stretched out before him, each variety in its proper place. The old bench stood under the oak tree, the words, "Where love blooms eternal," carved into its wood. "But why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "All this expense, all this effort." Thomas stepped forward, taking his father's hands. "Because this is your home, Dad. Because after Mum and after we lost her, this place kept you going. The garden, Thunder, all of it. It was your connection to her. When the fire took it away, it was like losing her all over again. We couldn't bear to see you so lost." Sarah joined them, linking her arm through Will's. "You're not a burden, Will, you never were. We just wanted to give you back your life, your memories, your connection to Margaret." A soft cough interrupted them. Mrs. Pembroke stood at the garden gate, holding a familiar tea tray. "Thought you might need this," she said, smiling through her own tears. "Welcome home, Will." As they settled around the old kitchen table, recreated exactly as it had been, Will looked at his family with new eyes. All those secret phone calls, the mysterious conversations, the detailed questions about every aspect of the cottage. They had been rebuilding not just a house, but his heart. Thunder's whinny drifted in through the open window, mixing with the familiar sounds of the village. The church bells, the distant bleating of sheep, the rustle of wind through the oak tree's leaves. In the garden, Margaret's roses bloomed in the spring sunshine, their scent carrying on the breeze like a welcome home. Will reached for his notebook, then stopped. He didn't need to write down these memories anymore. They were all around him, alive and real and permanent once more. In the corner of his eye, he could almost see Margaret smiling, her presence as tangible as the love that had rebuilt their home. The first few days back in the cottage passed in a dreamlike haze for Will. Each morning, he would wake expecting to find himself back in Thomas's London townhouse, only to open his eyes to the familiar view of his garden, exactly as it had always been. The miracle of it never ceased to amaze him. This particular morning, he stood in his dressing gown by the kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the garden in shades of gold. The kettle whistled on the stove, the same model he and Margaret had always used, somehow sourced by Thomas's determined research. "I see you're still an early riser," came Mrs. Pembroke's voice from the garden door. She hadn't lost her habit of appearing with fresh scones and village news. "The Garden Society ladies are wondering if you'll be joining us for the summer planning meeting." Will turned from the window, gesturing for her to sit at the kitchen table. "I hadn't thought about it," he admitted, setting out cups for tea. "Though I suppose I should, now that I have a garden again." "Have?" Mrs. Pembroke raised an eyebrow. "Will Harrison, you never stopped having a garden. Why do you think we all kept cuttings of Margaret's plants? We knew you'd be back someday." As if to emphasize her point, Thunder's morning whinny drifted in through the open window, followed by the familiar sound of his hooves on grass. Will had spent every morning since his return sharing breakfast with his old friend, making up for lost time. "Sarah tells me you've been studying the irrigation system plans," Mrs. Pembroke continued, buttering a scone. "Making improvements already, are you?" Will smiled, thinking of the notebook he'd filled with ideas over the past few days. "There are some new techniques I've been reading about. Margaret always said the garden should keep growing, keep changing." "Speaking of change," Mrs. Pembroke's eyes twinkled, "have you seen what the Henderson girls did with the community garden while you were away? Absolute disaster. We could use your expertise." Before Will could respond, Thomas appeared in the doorway looking surprisingly casual in jeans and a work shirt. He'd taken a week off to help Will settle in, though settling in mainly consisted of watching his father rediscover every careful detail they'd recreated. "Morning, Dad, Mrs. P," he yawned, helping himself to tea. "Planning another garden takeover?" "Merely suggesting that your father's talents might be needed in the community garden," Mrs. Pembroke sniffed. "Though if you're planning to stay for the morning, Thomas, the Rose Arch could use some reinforcement." Will watched the easy banter between them, realizing how much work must have gone into not just rebuilding his home, but maintaining his place in the village community. They hadn't just preserved his memories, they'd kept his future intact. After breakfast, Will found himself walking through his garden with new eyes. Everything was exactly as he remembered, yes, but there was also room for growth, for new memories. The old notebook he'd filled with desperate recollections now sat in a kitchen drawer, replaced by a new one full of plans and possibilities. Thunder nickered softly as Will approached the paddock, his velvet nose searching for the apple he knew would be in Will's pocket. Some habits never changed, and Will was grateful for each one he rediscovered. "What do you think, old friend?" he murmured, feeding Thunder the apple. "Shall we show the young ones how to properly manage a garden?" The sound of bikes on the gravel drive drew his attention. The Henderson girls, Amy and Sophie, stood nervously at the garden gate, their young faces full of hope. "Mr. Harrison?" Amy, the elder at 12, called out. "Mum said you might be able to help us with our vegetable patch. We've tried everything, but nothing's growing right." Will felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest, the same feeling he'd had whenever Margaret would bring home struggling plants, determined to save them. "Well," he said, opening the gate, "let's see what we can do about that." The morning unfolded in a series of small miracles. Will found himself moving between Thunder's paddock and the garden, offering advice to the girls, watching Thomas wrestle with the Rose Arch, and accepting a steady stream of visitors who just happened to be passing by. Sarah arrived around noon, carrying lunch and a knowing smile. She found them all in the garden, Will demonstrating proper pruning techniques to the Henderson girls, Thomas covered in leaves and looking pleased with himself, and Mrs. Pembroke holding court from the garden bench. "I'd say things are getting back to normal," she remarked, setting out sandwiches on the old garden table. Will looked around at the scene, his restored home, his family, his community gathering in the garden just as they always had. "Not back to normal," he corrected gently. "Forward to something even better." That evening, after everyone had gone home and the garden lay quiet in the twilight, Will sat in Margaret's chair by the fireplace. The restored wedding photograph caught the last rays of sunlight, and for a moment he could almost hear her laugh, could almost feel her hand on his shoulder. "You'd love what they've done with the place," he said softly to her image. "Everything exactly as it was, but somehow new again. Rather like me, I suppose." Thunder's gentle whinny floated in through the window, accompanied by the evening chorus of birds in the oak tree. Will opened his new notebook, but instead of recording memories, he began to sketch plans, improvements for the community garden, ideas for teaching the Henderson girls about heritage vegetables, designs for a new section of the rose garden. As darkness fell, the cottage settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs. In the kitchen, he could hear the tap's slight drip, another detail Thomas had somehow recreated, and smell the lingering scent of Sarah's cooking from lunch. Will ran his hand along the arm of Margaret's chair, feeling the exact texture of the fabric they'd chosen together so many years ago. Everything was the same, yet everything was different. His heart was no longer a museum of memories, but a garden itself, rich with the past and ready for new growth. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Through the window he could see most of the Garden Society ladies, armed with tea and notebooks. Mrs. Pembroke stood at the front, looking determined. "We've got a council meeting about the community garden tomorrow," she announced as Will opened the door. "And we need our expert back." Will smiled, thinking of Margaret's voice in his head. There's always room for more beauty. He gestured them inside, into the warm light of his restored home, ready to plan tomorrow's gardens. The community garden stretched before Will like a canvas awaiting its artist. In the week since his return, word had spread through the village about his renewed involvement, and now a small crowd had gathered for what was being unofficially called the Great Garden Revival. "It's not that we haven't tried," Amy Henderson explained, showing Will the struggling vegetable beds. "But nothing grows quite right." Will knelt beside the raised beds, his experienced hands testing the soil. Around him, villagers watched with barely concealed anticipation, some holding garden tools, others clutching notebooks, all ready to learn from the man who had created what many considered the finest garden in the county. "The soil's too compact," he diagnosed, demonstrating how to properly aerate it. "And you've got the companion planting all wrong. Tomatoes and basil are friends, you see, but tomatoes and potatoes, not so much." Sarah, who had driven down from London for the day, watched from the sidelines with Mrs. Pembroke. "I haven't seen him this animated in months," she whispered. "Of course not," Mrs. Pembroke replied with satisfaction. "He needed his purpose back. Gardens aren't just about plants, my dear. They're about nurturing life itself." The morning unfolded like a well-choreographed dance. Will moved from section to section, sharing decades of knowledge accumulated alongside Margaret. He taught the Henderson girls about natural pest control, showed the church ladies how to properly prune their roses, and helped Thomas, who had also come for the day, design a new irrigation system similar to the one at the cottage. "Your mother would be proud," he told Thomas during a brief break. They sat on a newly installed bench, watching the community work together to implement Will's suggestions. "She always said gardens were meant to be shared." Thomas smiled, watching his father's restored confidence. "That's why we had to bring you back, Dad. Not just for you, but for all of this." He gestured to the bustling garden where villagers of all ages worked together, following Will's guidance. As the day progressed, Will found himself remembering countless afternoons spent with Margaret in their own garden, experimenting with new techniques and sharing their discoveries with neighbors. Now, he was continuing that tradition, but with a depth of experience that made each lesson more valuable. "Mr. Harrison," called Sophie Henderson, "could you show us again how to stake the tomatoes properly?" Will demonstrated the technique, adding, "Your grandmother used to grow the finest tomatoes in the village, you know. She and your mother would bring us basketfuls every summer, and Margaret would turn them into the most remarkable sauce." Stories flowed as naturally as the garden techniques, weaving past and present together. Will found himself sharing not just gardening knowledge, but the history of the village itself, told through its gardens and the people who tended them. During lunch, spread out on blankets among the newly organized beds, Mrs. Pembroke made an announcement. "The village council has approved our proposal. The community garden will be expanded and—" She paused for effect. "They've asked Will to oversee the entire project." A cheer went up from the gathered villagers. Will felt his cheeks flush with pleasure, and something more, the recognition that his life had bloomed anew in ways he hadn't imagined possible. Sarah squeezed his hand. "See, you're not just getting your old life back. You're building something new." As the afternoon sun began to sink, Will took a final walk through the transformed garden. Already it showed signs of the care and attention it had received. The vegetable beds were properly organized, the flowers arranged for optimal growth, and new seedlings promised future harvests. Thunder's distant whinny reminded him it was nearly feeding time. "Go on," Thomas urged. "We can finish up here. Sarah and I will come by for dinner before heading back to London." The walk home took longer than usual, with neighbors stopping him to ask questions about their own gardens or simply to welcome him back to village life. By the time he reached his gate, the sunset was painting the sky in shades that reminded him of Margaret's favorite roses. In the paddock, Thunder greeted him with familiar enthusiasm. As Will fed him his evening apple, he noticed new growth on the old rose bushes that lined the fence. Margaret's own cuttings, carefully preserved and now thriving once again. Inside the cottage, he found Mrs. Pembroke had let herself in, Some habits never changed, and was setting out tea. "Successful day," she noted, handing him a cup. Will sank into his chair, feeling pleasantly tired. Margaret always said a garden needs 3 things: knowledge, love, and community. Today had all 3. "Speaking of community," Mrs. Pembroke said casually, "the Garden Society ladies were wondering if you'd consider teaching a proper course. Something regular, to pass on all that knowledge." Before Will could respond, Thomas and Sarah arrived, bringing with them the sounds and smells of dinner preparation. The cottage came alive with their presence, just as it had in the old days when Margaret would cook for whoever happened to drop by. As they gathered around the kitchen table, Will looked at his family, both blood and chosen, and felt Margaret's presence in every corner of the room. She would have loved this, he thought. The house full of life, the garden growing strong, and new purposes sprouting from old roots. Later, after everyone had gone and the cottage settled into its nighttime quiet, Will sat in the garden, watching the stars appear above the oak tree. In his new notebook, he began sketching plans for the expanded community garden, adding notes about teaching methods and seasonal projects. Thunder's soft nickering mixed with the evening breeze, carrying the scent of Margaret's roses. Will smiled, feeling more at home than he had in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new growth, new life to nurture, and he was ready for all of it, his roots firmly replanted in the soil of his restored life. The summer sun painted long shadows across the community garden as Will surveyed his latest class. What had started as informal gardening advice had blossomed into twice-weekly sessions that drew people from neighboring villages. Today's group included everyone from retired professors to young families, all eager to learn the art of heritage gardening. "The secret," Will explained, holding up a heritage rose cutting, "isn't just in the technique. It's in understanding the story behind each plant." He gestured to the thriving garden around them. "Every flower, every vegetable here has a history, just as we all do." Among his students, Will spotted Amy and Sophie Henderson filming the demonstration on their phones. They'd started a surprisingly popular social media channel about the garden's revival, calling themselves the Heritage Helpers. Their latest video about Will's traditional composting methods had garnered attention from gardening enthusiasts across the country. "Mr. Harrison," Amy called out, her phone still recording, "can you tell us about this rose variety? Isn't it the same one from your garden?" Will smiled, recognizing the deep crimson blooms. "Indeed it is. This variety was Margaret's favorite, the Royal William Rose. She planted our first bush the day we moved into the cottage." He carefully demonstrated the proper cutting angle. "Now who'd like to try?" As his students practiced with their own cuttings, Will noticed Thomas and Sarah standing at the garden entrance. They tried to visit every weekend, but this was unexpected. It was only Wednesday. "Surprise inspection," he teased as they approached. "Actually, Dad," Thomas looked unusually excited, "we've had an interesting call from a television producer. They've seen the girls' videos about the garden revival and, well, they're interested in doing a feature about traditional gardening methods, about you specifically." Will blinked in surprise. "Me? But I'm just teaching what your mother and I learned over the years." "Exactly," Sarah chimed in. "That's what they want, authentic knowledge, real experiences. They think it could be part of a series about preserving traditional skills." Before Will could respond, Mrs. Pembroke appeared with her impeccable timing. "Did you tell him about the television people? I've already got calls from half the village offering to help." Will looked around at his flourishing class, at the eager faces waiting to continue their lesson. Would they want to film here, in the community garden, and at the cottage?" Thomas nodded. "They're particularly interested in how the garden restoration brought the community together." Will's mind drifted to Margaret, remembering how she'd always said their garden knowledge should be preserved somehow. "She'd have loved this," he murmured, more to himself than the others. "So you'll do it?" Sarah asked hopefully. Will turned back to his waiting students. "What do you think? Shall we share our little garden revolution with a bigger audience?" The enthusiastic response made him laugh. Even Thunder, visible in his paddock beyond the garden wall, seemed to add his approval with a well-timed whinny. The rest of the afternoon's class took on an extra energy. Will found himself sharing not just techniques but stories about Margaret's experimental plant combinations, about the village's gardening history, about the ways traditional knowledge adapted to modern challenges. As the students left, many lingering to ask additional questions or share their own gardening stories, Will felt a familiar presence beside him. Mrs. Pembroke stood watching the sunset paint the garden in golden light. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when Thomas and Sarah first told me about their plan to rebuild the cottage, I wondered if it might be too much, too many memories, too much of the past. But look what you've created here, Will. Something old and something new growing together." Will nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Every day brought a perfect balance of cherished memories and new experiences. The cottage was still his sanctuary, but now it was also a place of learning and growth for others. Thunder's evening whinny called him home. As Will walked the familiar path, he passed several of his students tending their own gardens, each implementing techniques he'd taught them. Small pieces of Margaret's garden philosophy spreading through the village, taking root in new soil. At home, he found Thomas and Sarah in the kitchen, surrounded by papers, preliminary information from the television producers. But what caught Will's eye was a familiar notebook on the table. "We found this while gathering background information," Thomas explained. It was Will's old notebook, the one where he desperately recorded every detail of the cottage during his time in London. Will picked it up, feeling its weight. Once it had been filled with grief and loss. Now as he flipped through the pages, he saw something different. Not just memories, but blueprints. Every detail he'd recorded had helped rebuild not just his home, but his entire life. "You know," he said slowly, "perhaps we should show this to the television people. Help them understand how a garden isn't just about plants. It's about community, continuity, and growth." Sarah smiled, understanding. From memory book to teaching tool. Exactly. Will placed the notebook among the production papers. Margaret always said every garden tells a story. Maybe it's time to help others tell theirs. As evening settled over the cottage, Will sat in his familiar chair by the fireplace. Through the window he could see his students' cars still parked near the community garden. They were implementing his lessons under the last light of day. Thunder's soft nickering drifted in on the breeze, mixing with the sounds of Thomas and Sarah preparing dinner in the kitchen. The restored wedding photograph caught the last rays of sunlight, and Will could almost hear Margaret's voice. "Every ending is just a new beginning in disguise." He opened his new notebook, its pages now filled with lesson plans and student notes, and began sketching ideas for the television series. Perhaps, he thought, this was the real purpose of all that had happened. Not just to restore what was lost, but to create something new that could help others grow their own gardens of memory and hope. The evening light faded, but the cottage glowed with warmth and purpose. In the garden, Margaret's roses bloomed under the rising moon, their fragrance carrying promises of tomorrow's growth. The television crew arrived on a perfect autumn morning, dew still clinging to the roses, as Will conducted his regular community garden class. The producer, a thoughtful woman named Claire, had insisted on filming a regular session before starting their formal interviews. "Just be yourself," she'd said. "That's what drew us to your story, the authenticity of it all." Will barely noticed the cameras as he demonstrated proper bulb planting techniques to his eager students. The garden had transformed since those first revival days, now boasting neat rows of heritage vegetables, traditional herb gardens, and flowering sections that would have made Margaret proud. "The trick with bulbs," he explained, hands deep in the rich soil, "is to think about the spring they'll bring while working in the autumn. Gardening is always about faith in the future." Amy and Sophie Henderson, now self-appointed documentarians of the garden's progress, moved between the television crew and their own social media recording. Their Heritage Helpers channel had grown into something of a phenomenon, attracting gardening enthusiasts from across the country. "Mr. Harrison," Sophie called out, "can you tell everyone about the special bulbs we're planting today?" Will held up a handful of daffodil bulbs. "These come from Margaret's original garden. Mrs. Pembroke had saved some when they naturalized into her yard years ago. Now they'll bloom here in the community garden, continuing their story." The television crew exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of moment they'd hoped to capture. Claire made a subtle gesture to her cameraman to move closer. As the morning progressed, Will found himself sharing not just gardening knowledge, but the philosophy he and Margaret had developed over their years together. Every technique came with a story, every plant with a memory, every lesson with a deeper meaning about life and growth. Thomas and Sarah arrived mid-morning, bringing refreshments for everyone. They'd taken to spending more time in the village lately, with Thomas even talking about opening a local office for his company. The internet works just as well here as in London, he'd pointed out, and the commute is much more pleasant. During a break in filming, Claire pulled Will aside. "This is more than we'd hoped for," she said enthusiastically. "Would you be open to expanding the series? Not just about the garden restoration, but about traditional gardening knowledge in general?" Will glanced at his students, busy practicing their bulb planting techniques. "You mean help other communities start something like this?" "Exactly. Your story could inspire similar projects across the country. People are hungry for this kind of knowledge, this sense of connection to the land and to each other." Before Will could respond, Mrs. Pembroke appeared with her trademark timing and a tray of tea. "He'll do it," she announced confidently. "Won't you, Will?" Margaret would have loved seeing her garden philosophy spread like this. Will accepted a cup of tea, watching the activity around him. The community garden had become more than he'd ever imagined, not just a place of learning, but a hub of connection and growth. Every week brought new students, new stories, new life. "You know," he said slowly, "Margaret always said a garden needs 3 things: knowledge, love, and community. Perhaps that's what we're really growing here. Not just plants, but connections." Claire's eyes lit up. "That's it exactly. Would you be willing to share that on camera? It perfectly captures what we're trying to show." The afternoon's filming moved to Will's cottage garden, where Thunder provided unscripted entertainment by sticking his head into every shot, hoping for treats. The television crew was enchanted by the horse's antics and the obvious bond between him and Will. "He's as much a part of the story as the garden," Will explained, feeding Thunder an apple. "Continuity in the midst of change, just like the oak tree and Margaret's roses." As the day drew to a close, the community garden students gathered in Will's garden for a final shoot. They sat on blankets among the flowers, sharing stories of their own growing adventures and future plans. "See what you've started?" Thomas said quietly to his father. "This isn't just about preserving the past anymore. It's about growing the future." Will looked around at the scene. The television crew capturing the natural interaction, Amy and Sophie updating their social media followers, Mrs. Pembroke holding court from the garden bench, and his students exchanging gardening tips and cuttings. In every corner, he saw Margaret's influence blooming in new ways. Thunder nickered softly from his paddock, and Will smiled, remembering Margaret's words about every ending being a new beginning. She had been right, as usual. The fire that had seemed to end everything had actually planted seeds of something larger, something that could touch more lives than their private garden ever could. As the evening light faded, the television crew packed up, promising to return for more filming next week. Will's students lingered, helping to tidy up and making plans for the next class. The garden hummed with the energy of growth and possibility. Later, sitting in his chair by the fireplace, Will opened his teaching notebook. Between the lesson plans and student notes, he began writing something new. Ideas for the television series, ways to help other communities start their own garden revivals. Thoughts about preserving traditional knowledge for future generations. The restored wedding photograph caught the last light of day, and Will could almost hear Margaret's delighted laugh. "See?" she would have said. "The garden always knows what it's doing. We just have to trust in the growing." Outside, Thunder's gentle whinny mixed with the evening chorus of birds in the oak tree. The cottage settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs, while in the garden, Margaret's roses released their evening fragrance into the autumn air. Will smiled, feeling the perfect balance of past and future, of memory and growth, of ending and beginning. Tomorrow would bring more students, more cameras, more opportunities to share what he and Margaret had learned about gardens and life. The seeds they had planted together would continue to grow, spreading their legacy in ways they could never have imagined. In the gentle darkness, Will could feel Margaret's presence in every corner of their restored home, not as a ghost of the past, but as a partner in this new adventure. Their garden had always been about more than just plants. It was about growing love, nurturing community, and believing in tomorrow's blooms. And now that garden was growing larger than ever, spreading its roots through the hearts and hands of others, creating a living legacy that would continue to flourish long after the cameras stopped rolling. The winter morning dawned crisp and clear as Will stood in his garden, surrounded by the first frost of the season. 1 year had passed since Thomas and Sarah had brought him home to his restored cottage, and what a year it had been. The television series, Heritage Gardens, had just aired its final episode, becoming an unexpected success that sparked community garden projects across the country. Will's inbox was filled with messages from viewers sharing their own stories of garden revival and community connection. "Ready for the big day?" Sarah's voice came from the kitchen door. She and Thomas had arrived early to help prepare for today's celebration, the official opening of the expanded community garden and the launch of the Heritage Garden Training Center. Will nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. Margaret would have loved this. She always said gardens were meant to be shared. The new training center had been Thomas's idea, inspired by the overwhelming response to the television series. The village council had eagerly provided the old community hall, and Will's students had transformed its grounds into a living classroom. "Dad?" Thomas emerged from the cottage, carrying steaming mugs of tea. "The first guests are starting to arrive." Indeed, cars were already pulling into the village, carrying people from across the country who had been touched by Will's story. Garden Society members from neighboring counties, viewers inspired by the television series, and even a few well-known horticulturists had come to be part of this day. Thunder nickered from his paddock, already spotting familiar faces. The Henderson girls hurried past, cameras ready to document everything for their now flourishing social media channel. They had become unofficial ambassadors for the heritage gardening movement, their youthful enthusiasm perfectly complementing Will's traditional knowledge. "Mr. Harrison," Amy called out, excitement clear in her voice, "wait until you see what we've prepared for the ceremony." The morning unfolded like a well-tended garden, each element blooming in its perfect time. Will watched as people filled the new training center, their faces bright with anticipation. Mrs. Pembroke supervised the refreshments with her usual efficiency, while Thomas handled the technical arrangements for the day's presentations. As Will prepared to address the gathered crowd, he felt Margaret's presence stronger than ever. The training center's main hall had been decorated with photographs from their years of gardening together, alongside images of the community garden's revival and stills from the television series. "Welcome," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "A year ago I thought I had lost everything, but what I've learned, what we've all learned together, is that gardens, like life itself, have a way of renewing themselves." The speech flowed naturally, just as Margaret had always told him it would when he spoke from the heart. He shared their story, the fire that had seemed to end everything, the love that had rebuilt his home and the unexpected growth that had followed. But the true magic of the day lay in the stories others shared, tales of communities coming together, of traditional knowledge preserved and passed on, of gardens becoming bridges between generations. Each story was a flower in the bouquet of what they had created together. The Henderson girls premiered their special video, a touching compilation of the year's journey from restored cottage to thriving movement. There wasn't a dry eye in the house when they showed clips of Will's first tentative days back in his garden, contrasted with recent scenes of him confidently teaching hundreds. As afternoon approached, the celebration moved to the community garden itself. Despite the winter chill, the carefully planned cold weather sections showed that a garden could be beautiful in any season. Will led tours through the new teaching areas, each designed to showcase different aspects of traditional gardening methods. "You've created something extraordinary here," Claire, the television producer, told him. "This isn't just about gardening anymore. It's about healing, community, and hope." Will smiled, watching his students demonstrate winter pruning techniques to interested visitors. "No," he corrected gently, "we've created something extraordinary together. That's what Margaret always said about gardens. They grow best when tended by many hands." Thunder's paddock had become an impromptu gathering spot, the old horse happily accepting attention and treats from visitors. He seemed to understand the importance of the day, standing proudly as people took photos and heard the story of his role in the garden's revival. As the winter sun began to set early, casting long shadows across the frost-touched garden, Will found a quiet moment to slip away to his cottage. In the familiar comfort of his kitchen, he opened his notebook, not the old one filled with desperate memories, but the new one overflowing with lesson plans, student notes, and dreams for the future. Sarah found him there, adding notes about the day's events. "Everything all right?" Will looked up, smiling. "Just thinking about what Margaret would say about all this." Remember how she used to tell me I was too set in my ways?" Sarah laughed, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "She'd be proud, Will. You've taken everything you loved and helped it grow into something even more beautiful." Through the window, they could see the lights coming on in the training center, where Thomas was setting up for the evening's festivities. The sound of happy voices drifted across the garden, mixing with Thunder's occasional gentle whinny. "You know," Will said thoughtfully, "when you and Thomas brought me back here, I thought you were just restoring what I'd lost. But you were really giving me the chance to build something new." Sarah squeezed his hand. "That's what good gardens do, isn't it? They honor what came before while always growing toward tomorrow." Will nodded, thinking of all the tomorrows yet to come, new students to teach, new gardens to help restore, new stories to be part of. The cottage was still his sanctuary, but now it was also a source of inspiration for others, just as Margaret had always said it could be. As they walked back to the training center together, Will paused to look at his garden in the gathering dusk. Margaret's roses, carefully protected for winter, stood like silent guardians of all they had created together. The old oak tree spread its bare branches against the winter sky, a reminder that every season had its purpose in the cycle of growth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but for now, Will simply savored the moment. He had come full circle, from loss to restoration to renewal, and the garden had been his guide every step of the way. Spring came early that year, as if nature itself was eager to celebrate the first anniversary of the Heritage Garden Training Center. Will stood in his cottage garden, watching the morning sun illuminate the fresh growth emerging everywhere he looked. The garden had evolved over the past year, incorporating new ideas while maintaining its essential character. Margaret's roses still held pride of place, but they now shared space with experimental beds, where students tested traditional methods alongside modern innovations. "Morning, Dad," Thomas called from the garden gate. He and Sarah had finally made the move to the village, converting an old farmhouse just down the lane. Their London home was now a distant memory, much like Will's days of feeling lost and alone. "You're early," Will noted, smiling at his son. The morning dew had barely dried, and Thunder was still enjoying his breakfast in the paddock. "Couldn't sleep," Thomas admitted, too excited about today's announcement. The announcement in question was the launch of the Heritage Garden Network, a nationwide initiative inspired by their local success. What had started as one community's effort to restore a garden and heal a heart had grown into something far greater. Sarah arrived with Mrs. Pembroke, both carrying baskets of freshly baked scones. The cottage kitchen quickly filled with the familiar sounds and scents of community gathering. Through the window, Will could see the first of his students arriving at the training center. "The television crew is setting up," Sarah reported, pouring tea. "Claire says the new series has already been picked up by 3 networks." Will nodded, thinking of how far they'd come from those first tentative classes in the community garden. The Henderson Girls' social media channels now reached hundreds of thousands of followers, spreading traditional gardening knowledge to a new generation. "Did you finish your speech?" Mrs. Pembroke asked, arranging scones on Margaret's old serving plate. "Actually," Will said, pulling out his notebook, "I thought we might do something different today." The morning unfolded like a carefully planned garden, each element complementing the others perfectly. As people gathered in the training center's main hall, Will looked out at the faces of those who had become not just students but family. Amy and Sophie Henderson set up their equipment, ready to broadcast the day's events to their global audience. Their mother had told Will just yesterday how the girls' college applications would focus on their role in the heritage gardening movement. Thunder's whinny drifted through the open windows, accompanied by the sound of spring birds in the oak tree. Will touched the restored wedding photograph he now carried in his jacket pocket, a reminder of the love that had started it all. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, standing before the assembled crowd, "a year ago we opened this center with the hope of preserving traditional gardening knowledge. Today we're here to talk about growth, not just of plants, but of dreams, community, and hope." As Will shared their plans for the Heritage Garden Network, he could see the excitement building in the room. Representatives from communities across the country leaned forward, eager to learn how they could create their own garden revival stories. But it was the next announcement that brought tears to many eyes. The Margaret Harrison Memorial Scholarship, Will revealed, his voice rich with emotion, will provide funding for communities to restore their own heritage gardens. Because, as my wife always said, there's always room for more beauty in the world. The response was immediate and heartfelt. Will watched as people who had never known Margaret embraced her philosophy of gardening as a way to build connections and heal hearts. Later, as the spring day warmed, Will led a walk through his garden. Students old and new listened as he shared not just techniques, but the wisdom that had grown alongside his plants. Every garden tells a story, he explained, pausing by Margaret's roses. But the most beautiful gardens are those that make room for new chapters while honoring what came before. Thunder stood at his paddock fence, watching the tour with wise eyes. The old horse had become something of a mascot for the heritage gardening movement, his gentle presence a reminder of the continuity that survived even the greatest changes. As evening approached, Will found a quiet moment in his cottage kitchen. Sarah was organizing notes from the day's meetings, while Thomas discussed expansion plans with Claire. Mrs. Pembroke supervised the cleaning up, ensuring everything returned to its proper place. Will opened his notebook, not to write, but to tuck in a pressed rose petal from Margaret's garden. The pages were filled now not with memories of loss, but with plans for growth, sketches for future gardens, and the names of those whose lives had been touched by their story. Through the window he could see his students lingering in the garden, sharing cuttings and stories as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. The old oak tree cast long shadows across the lawn, its branches now full of spring growth. "You were right, my love," he whispered to Margaret's presence, which seemed to fill the cottage like evening light. "The garden always knows what it's doing. We just have to trust in the growing." Thunder's gentle whinny floated on the spring breeze, mixing with the sound of laughter from the garden. Will smiled, feeling the perfect balance of past and future, of memory and possibility, of endings and beginnings. The cottage settled around him, full of life and purpose. In the garden, Margaret's roses reached toward the evening sky, their blooms promising another season of beauty and growth. The Heritage Garden Network would spread their story far and wide, but here in this place of love and renewal was where it would always begin. Will stepped out into his garden one last time that evening, after everyone had gone. The spring air was rich with the scent of new growth and old roses, of memory and promise, of lessons learned and yet to be shared. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to grow. But for now, in the gentle gathering dark, Will simply stood in his garden, the garden that had been lost and found, that had grown from memory into legacy, that had taught him and so many others that love, like the hardiest perennial, would always find a way to bloom again.